Okay, hello and welcome back from the short break. We have now two sessions on the state of the art in social modeling, where we specifically want to bring in social scientists. So some of our presenters don't really have a social science background, but are working on social science questions, social science research questions. The first presenter is Gary Polhill. He is a research scientist at the James Hutton Institute in the UK and has a focus in his research on human natural systems. And today he will be talking to us about social simulation modeling with landscape systems. Gary, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And just to say that this talk draws on work that I've done with my colleagues Alessandro Gimona, who also works at the James Hutton Institute, Nick Gotts, who's now retired, and Andrew Jarvis, who's a researcher at the Lancaster Environment Centre. So just to give you a brief outline of what I intend to do, since you've heard quite a lot about agent-based modelling already, I will try and keep the introduction to agent-based modelling very brief indeed. And then I want to talk about semantic integration, which is, I think, an important problem that we need to address as we try to bring together knowledge from the social and biophysical and environmental sciences. So they're not something to be taken lightly. And I also wanted just to show some examples of my own work with my colleagues on this model called Fearless Spawn, where we've tried to simulate the incentivization of measures to enhance biodiversity. Yeah, so without further ado, I have to click. So agent-based modelling has various origins, and Mark pointed to some of these earlier in his talk. So the complex systems origin, if you like, via the Santa Fe Institute would be the insight that heterogeneity of actors in the landscape and interactions among them matter. And I think we got a lot of really great evidence from Mark that that's the case. There are economists in the social simulation community who are dissatisfied with the Homo economicus model. There are social scientists who are interested in more formal exploration of their theories and you know, how they play out dynamically. And there's also a bunch of people from the sort of distributed artificial intelligence community who are looking at ways in which they can draw on social and psychological theory to simulate software agents operating on the web and other IT systems. But in general, agent-based modeling is a computer simulation that explicitly represents individual heterogeneity and interactions, or at least that's what I mean by it. So agents can actually represent various different kinds of individual, and certainly once we get up to higher levels of social aggregation, you encounter controversy from a philosophical perspective with respect to the assumption of methodological individualism, which is essentially that humans are the highest social aggregation that can make decisions. But you will find agent-based models that even simulate nation states as agents. And interactions are any effect that one individual can have on another. There are various direct kind of interpersonal interactions that take place, like through markets, and norms and invitation, things like this. But there are also stigmergic interactions, as they're called, rather lovely word, in which the interactions are mediated through physical persistence. And certainly landscapes would be an example of that. So just to talk about this idea of kind of over the hedge farming, if you like, it doesn't necessarily require one farmer to directly talk to another farmer to see what they're doing, because what they're doing is to some extent or another visible on the landscape. And so they don't actually have to directly talk to each other. for people who are interested in social networks, these interactions needn't be confined to a single kind or type of relationship, like you know, family or business to business or friendship or whatever. You can have multiple different kinds of interaction if you so wish. There are various motivations for agent-based social simulation. To do with, you know, a third way to do social science, to quote Scott Moss's inaugural lecture from at Manchester Metropolitan University. In other words, it's more formal than qualitative approaches, something that some qualitative social sciences would find controversial, and less constrained than quantitative. So there's less need to make these heroic assumptions about human cognition that Mark referred to earlier. And there's much less reliance on calculus and preoccupation with equilibria, because again, we're doing simulations, so we don't need to analyze things in that way. I've said greater transparency here, though I think that's potentially a contentious point. I think it all depends on whether you can understand and read code better or worse than you can understand or read narrative or you know, systems of differential equations or whatever. And they are quite general, so there's been a wide range of applications. I would say that to some extent land use change and land-related issues are, I think, one of the kind of ideal applications for agent-based modeling, but they've been applied in lots of other domains as well. You might also want to engage with agent-based social simulation because it enables explorations of life as it could be. That's a phrase from, I've suddenly forgotten the name of the significant author who said the term, but this is the idea, you know, how could things work? So they needn't necessarily be empirical, and indeed the model I'll show you isn't empirical in that sense. And you can use it to test theories as well. So, you know, once you've formalized your theory, you can play it out and see if it really does what you think it does. Now, there are issues with agent-based modeling. You know, it is enjoying a sort of moment of sun, shall we say, but there are issues. There is actually quite a long history of agent-based models, and I was fascinated again to see that you could argue almost Hagerstrand was doing this, as Mark said earlier. But I think one of the earliest agent-based models was the Schelling-Sekoda model of social segregation, and it's been about 50 years since that was published. Lansing and Kramer, more directly related to landscape change, did a study in the 1980s that was published in the early 90s in a book on rice paddies in a particular valley in Bali, and you know, that is one of the case studies that often gets quoted as an early example of agent-based models being used to give advice to policymakers, and it's 30 years since that happened. It's been 20 years since Dawn Parker and her colleagues organized a seminal meeting in Irvine, California, of all of the people who were doing agent-based models of land use and cover change at the time. And so it's kind of interesting that they're not, the agent-based models, they're not routinely used. It's not assumed that when you come across a very difficult problem with lots of complex social and environmental systems that are interacting with each other, that people are not routinely expecting agent-based models to be applied to these situations. Maybe one of the reasons is that they can become very complicated in social ecological systems. You can imagine you're simulating a lot of processes, and so the model becomes, if you like, or can become more difficult to understand than the real world, and you're obviously better off trying to understand the latter. And they can feature lots of agents operating at different scales, coupling ecological, biophysical, and social processes. Yeah, the method, there can be significant data requirements in empirical contexts. Now, the methodology is not particularly established, which means it's difficult to learn and difficult to teach. There's a lot you need to know to kind of get agent-based models up and running. People often expect to be able to do them on their own. But I would say that really what you should be aiming for is to build agent-based models in interdisciplinary teams. And I've put here this interdisciplinarity as being an issue. Because in a way, we're all encouraged to do more interdisciplinary science, and so this should be a good thing. But as those of us who at least predominantly do interdisciplinary research know all too well, there are various ways it can go wrong. There are other issues that there seems to be a bit of a blind spot towards around agent-based modeling in the social sciences generally. So this is a paper analysing citations of the Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulation, which, if you like, is the agent-based modelling journal. You can see from the bright pink citations that authors in JAS are making a lot of citations in the social sciences literature, but citations to JAS, the social sciences are forming a relatively small proportion, with much more from computing science and engineering and from natural science than social science, and that's a pity. We've also touched on issues with decision making, and again, there's this sort of lack of, it's seen as an issue that there's a lack of standardization around what decision-making algorithm should I use to simulate every farmer in the world or whatever. But I think the key point is that actually, having looked at what agent-based modelers do with decision-making, often they're doing utility maximization, meaning that some of these supposed advantages of agent-based modeling, we don't have to look at these, that way of making decisions, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. People aren't actually doing it, and it's because there's often a lack of awareness of alternatives, I think, among some of those building these big land systems agent-based models. So there is room to improve the way we represent farmers' decision-making, and other agents indeed in the system. And there is exactly the same kind of controversy around how we might represent farmers' decisions as there might be about how we might represent the decisions of governments, developers, agencies, and all this sort of thing. So, you know, if it's problematic enough deciding how to represent an individual human being algorithmically, imagine how difficult it is to think about how we might represent decisions of aggregates individually. So moving on, there are a lot of issues with coupling models around how you go about it. So this paper by Antley, I don't know if that's how they pronounce their name, but that there are various different approaches. You can loosely couple them, so you just sort of feed the variable of one model into as an output into the input of another, and you sort of create these big systems of models where they're all exchanging output variables. You might have closer coupling where you have these subcomponents that are shared. But the ideal is always that you have full integration where you have one model with all the appropriate scales, but that means much less reuse and is much more expensive to produce. And if you're working with someone who has a very beautiful detailed crop model, you know, they don't want to rewrite it so that it interoperates with your agent-based decision-making model. However, there are significant risks with loose and close coupled modeling that Alexei Voinov and his colleague Shugart used the term integronsters, which is sort of concatenating integrated monster together. And this is the photo is of a shed that was in my garden many years ago. It's now knocked down, where you can see what the previous owner had done. They built one shed, and then they wanted a bit more, so they built another shed, and then they wanted to connect that shed to the previous shed, and so forth. And you end up with something that's, shall we say, artistically interesting, but not especially elegant or beautiful. And of course, the computing science literature has encountered various issues with integration, typically due to trying to merge and databases as companies buy and sell each other. And there can be various different conflicts in the ways in which these databases are configured and described, which are categorized as listed in the bullet points. And of course, all of these problems to do with the nomenclature, to do with how we describe the system itself in what's called the ontology of the models, can occur when integrating models. So, you know, we give a word to a specific variable, to a label. There's no guarantee that that label, even if another model has the same label, that those two mean the same thing, really mean the same thing. And I think, you know, this again is something to be very cautious about when we are coupling biophysical and social models together, and indeed even within those two domains, the same issues may occur. Of course, when you're simulating dynamics, you can also have conflicts that arise from the different algorithms that sub-processes might use to simulate particular dynamics. And if these sub-processes are locked in models that are not open in the sense of being open source, then there can, you know, you wouldn't even know this was happening, and this can cause significant issues in terms of the model's coherence and logical consistency. So I just wanted to give some prominence to this concept of ontologies, which is the way we describe the system. This is before we've even you know, simulated anything. It's just about how we decide what's included and what isn't, and how we choose to represent them using the different, shall we say, algorithmic constructs that are available to us. And what's very interesting is that certainly from a social science perspective, is that there is a debate in the ontology literature about whether ontologies are discovered or constructed. That again goes back to some of the very deep controversies within the social sciences themselves. And we have these questions as we build ontologies when we put our models together, and we all effectively do this when we build a model, about who is sharing that description of the system. Is it just the project team or the developers? Is it colleagues in you know, interdisciplinary colleagues in the project, or in the wider literature? You know, who agrees, who assesses whether this was a reasonable way to describe the system? And I think this has more significance than is merely captured by you know, the various fit to data matrix we might do in quantitative calibration and validation. And of course, these meanings can have political implications, as is illustrated by some of the disputation that goes on in the land use literature. So there's been a lot of efforts to define what a forest is, which should seem trivial. But as this paper by Chaz Don and colleagues illustrates, there are various different meanings and understandings of forest, and they end up concluding that no single operational forest definition can or should embody all of these dimensions. And Wong et al. Say that there are political implications of classifications, especially if they're applied universally or in contexts that are not suitable, where, for example, if you privilege tree cover over other classifications, you can serve the purposes of extraction-based forestry and modern conservation. So the same questions might arise when we ask the question, what is a farmer? And just to give you an illustration from Scotland, there's this question of, we might ask, what is an urban patch? And so we have an urban-rural classification that's used by the Scottish government. And I thought I'd highlight this little village in the north of Scotland called Tain, which just has a big enough population that it gets itself classified as urban, when I think there may be many in the world who would dispute just how urban Tain is, worthy location though that may be. So the important thing is that how we define the systems we're using is non-neutral, and it can embed imbalances of power. So on to my own model, which is called Fearless SPOM. This coupled a model called Fearless, which was simulating the decisions made by farmers about what crops to grow, with a biodiversity model called a stochastic patch occupancy model. And it's a kind of model where the biodiversity species in the landscape act like little bombs and kind of spread themselves using Gaussian distributions across the space. So we deliberately designed these to work together by having similar levels of abstraction, not duplicating processes, having compatible spatial and temporal scales, and compatible underlying assumptions. And it's because we're both involved with it. So this is important. It's not just taking something off the shelf. And the kind of thing that goes on is that the farmers choose what they're going to do. The SPOM then updates the habitats available for species and computes extinction and colonization. In the meantime, we've tried to work out what yield the farmers are going to get. The government might respond. The land managers get their harvest. They may learn from the experience and buy and sell land, and they may also go bankrupt. In terms of government response, it was nice to see Brett earlier, Brett Day, looking at activity or outcome incentives. We also introduced the option to reward individually or in a clustered way, and these create different kinds of feedback in the model. I thought it might be useful just to give you an idea of what the model really looks like when it's running. It was built before the era of GIS integration into agent-based models really became advanced. So what you're seeing is a lot of different colored patches and time series graphs going on. But what these show are the prevalence of different species in the space, and the number of times different land uses with different levels of intensity and hence suitability for habitat are shown. Having done a large number of simulations, we then can analyze the results, and essentially the bottom line is that we find outcome-based incentives are more robust to other influences on decision making, such as the market or input costs or what the land managers are hoping to achieve, provided the government offers enough money. So there is a tipping point in the system, and below that tipping point the market drives things and the biodiversity outcome isn't as good. Now, because I'm running a little short of time, I'm going to skip over a few slides here. A policy agent that was trying to achieve a specific level of biodiversity in the landscape as measured by a Shannon index using control theory, which might have been interesting to some of the mathematicians in the audience. But I thought, given some of the discussions about validation that we had earlier, it might be more constructive just to put this question about Occam's razor and these alternative trouser legs of time. So, we might have a nice simple model that can follow the trajectory that history happened to take, and it has very few parameters and is nice and easy to calibrate. Or we might have a model with many parameters that can follow alternative things that could have happened. Now, the current heuristic in modeling is that we would choose model A, but actually the specific trajectory that history took could have been highly contingent and unlikely to occur in general. To me, this casts doubt on whether we would really end up preferring that model. So this ability to look at alternative possible outcomes, I think, is important. I also wanted to highlight this point about generating social phenomena from the bottom up rather than curve fitting. So neural networks can approximate any function to with an arbitrary degree of error. So we can fit curves to social data if we want, including the exchange rate between the euro and the pound. But actually, since these curves tell you nothing about the fundamental relationships among the variables, especially if we use neural networks to do it, I wonder how. Well, I've said it's pointless scientifically, just to be provocative. But I think it's not just about being provocative. It's something I genuinely believe. These curves emerge from the micro interactions of the actors that affect what that exchange rate entails, and it can do with things like the beliefs of traders, which they themselves may be based on their assessments of political activities, news stories, and there are all the other things in that list that might apply. So then comes this question with respect to calibration and validation of whether you can grow that graph. Could you make that graph happen? And I think that's much harder than curve fitting. It's much harder, and it's already a hard problem, than searching a multidimensional space of parameters. And just to sort of return to some of the themes that I opened at the beginning, is that I think we need to look at strategically at what we need to do to make agent-based modeling more mainstream and expected when we start to encounter these problems. And I've outlined various areas I think need to be addressed to do it in this paper that's linked there. But in terms of the roles for mathematicians and statisticians, I think there needs to be some awareness that there are new methods we need to kind of deal with the. I don't want to be too precious about agent-based modeling, but we do things, I think, slightly differently, and I think this does open questions about what a fair way is to assess them. So then these questions come up about calibration and validation, where you might use approximate Bayesian computation, for example, or other methods to try and guess what suitable parameters might be. Can we somehow mathematically capture or statistically capture relationships among meanings so that we can convince ourselves somehow an ontology is valid, insofar as that may even be a meaningful thing to say. More pragmatically, I think there's unsettled methodology around population synthesis for agent-based models, and developing typologies of agents where we've tried to use data to develop and derive decision-making rules, and especially where these decision-making rules are themselves adaptive, so they allow the simulation of change. And of course, there's the option to explore meta-modeling, where we use the agent-based models as data sources. And that's pretty much all I want to say, other than to acknowledge the various funders of agent-based modeling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much. So I don't see any immediate question on Slido, where no one has raised their hands. So while we might wait for, oh, actually one just appeared on Slido. So the question is, could you say a bit about your approach to quantifying or understanding the uncertainty in model outcomes? How do you present these uncertainties when discussing the results with policymakers or other non-technical stakeholders?
So, yeah, I mean, agent-based models can generate, I mean, I would probably go back to this slide. Here we go. Essentially, from the same initial conditions, the specific dynamics in models can lead to very different outcomes. So uncertainty wouldn't likely be presented numerically, but qualitatively. These different outcomes, for example, that I'm showing here with the trajectories of the Shannon index in the bottom graph, those kind of 4 qualitatively different lines essentially correspond to different or qualitatively different outcomes in terms of the species mix and the ability to achieve good local biodiversity being hampered by the fact that there have been local extinctions because intervention to prevent that in that model was not timely enough. So I suppose I would present the uncertainties in qualitative terms, and perhaps going back to some of the points Brett Day was making in terms of what should we say, robust policy, minimizing maximum regret. So you might say that under some scenarios, unless you act in a particular way, you risk certain things happening, such as being unable to achieve a desired outcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. Sorry, thank you very much, Gary. Sorry again. Given the time progression, I would say we suggest we continue with Mark, and if there are more questions appearing, maybe we can get back to you again at the end of this session, and then you can answer them as well.